have with the Bible is that it's such an important document.
Yeah.
It's on such high a pedestal
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of the things in it I find can be a little irresponsible in
Okay.
that they have effects and consequences in the real world because as we were talking about 70% of this country is Christians,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of our laws and policies are dictated by Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it has some detrimental consequences where like you have in the 19th century, you
Yeah.
have slavers who are using the
Right.
Bible to and again they're not using it incorrectly
Yeah.
because the Bible has verses in it that can be used to justify slavery. Because God tells you exactly how to treat your slaves. He doesn't tell you not to have slaves to begin
Yeah.
with, right? And again, homophobic people use it, racist people use
Yeah.
it, sexist people use it. There's irresponsible things in the Bible, and like as we were talking about with what Jesus said with adultery, like I feel like those things are, I don't know. Maybe you can speak more on
Right.
it.
Right. And I think it definitely comes down to, and this sounds like a very insufficient answer, how people steward the message and steward that rhetoric, because you can take what the Bible says and redefine what it means. You recontextualize it. And so people can do that from a place of patriarchy. They can do that from a place of misogynism. They can do that from a place of homophobia. They can do that from a place of xenophobia. And they have, and it's been done, right? And then you can take that beyond fear and rhetoric and you can put that into violence, and that has been done, and it shouldn't have been done. Like any Christian who tries to tell you, oh, it should have been done, no, like that's no. So it's definitely how you steward the message and the words inside the book. And I think this is more of just a fun fact. So people bring up, there's definitely verses in the Bible talking about slavery and expectations with this slaves that you were keeping. But it's interesting that I don't think anybody who uses that talking point understands what the Bible actually says about slavery.
Okay.
Because there is an expectation of slaves, because that's just how things worked in the world. Like there's an expectation regardless. Like it's not as if the Bible was the only book to allow slavery, or as if the Jews were the only people to institute slavery.
Not the only book, but there were it was understood at that time that slavery was immoral.
And so it's interesting in that respect, and it certainly is. But recontextualizing what slaves were in both the Old and New Testament, because again, you could have great slave masters and poor slave masters, and that was the point originally, is to make people benevolent masters. But beyond that, you were not expected to keep a slave for their life. So indentured servitude would be a better definition, and we even have bad strings attached to indentured servitude because of recent history or documents that revealed the way that indentured servants were treated. But basically, there was a concept called the Year of Jubilee, and that was basically the Jewish calendar works in sevens, a lot of different sevens, and so 7 years, 7 weeks, 7 days, whatever. You would sell yourself. Nobody could take you as a slave. You could not be enslaved by somebody else. You had to sell yourself, usually to redeem a piece of property or do whatever. You would be the one voluntarily giving yourself to someone else, saying, I will be your servant. So that's step number one, is it's voluntary, right? Except war. And even then it's like, So you're selling yourself into it, and you are paid and you are given housekeeping. And again, it's up to the person who is lording over you how they're going to treat you. And I think it's Leviticus, or maybe it's Deuteronomy, somewhere in the Old Testament, where it's laying out all these expectations. There's this expectation that upon the year of Jubilee, every single person who has sold themselves into slavery will be redeemed. And this is a regularly occurring thing. And I believe it's it's either 7 or like 7 by 7, so 50 years. And usually, like, hopefully you're not a slave for 50 years, because that's just not a way to live. But there was an expectation that, and there's a feast surrounding it and all this other stuff, there's an expectation that nobody is a slave forever. And nobody is a slave solely to a person, because even while you were enslaved, you were expected to worship, right? You were expected to pay your respects to God. And I think, this is tangenting off, I'm sorry, going into the New Testament, Paul's rhetoric in Romans, specifically Romans 6, he talks about slavery and making yourselves slaves to the gospel and slaves to Christ, in that you don't get to choose whom you like. You don't get to choose the fact that you're a slave. You don't get to choose whether or not you're a slave. You only get to choose what you're a slave to, right? And so he was saying, do you want to be a slave to, and he says sin, like, do you want to be a slave to lust or to anger or to bitterness, or are you going to be a slave to the person who sets you free from everything else? And so, yes, there is certainly a lot of language surrounding the topic of slavery in the Bible, and there is an expectation of slavery in Old Testament history, I mean, even in New Testament history, and there's nothing, again, that says slavery should not be a thing, because it was an expectation, but there were expectations within that institution that were supposed to make it God honoring. Slavery was not meant to be something that was remotely dehumanizing, right? And so when we think about slavery as fundamentally dehumanizing and as if somebody's humanity is stripped from them when they become a slave,
They become objects, they're owned people.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It wasn't you owned somebody. It was genuinely hand servants and maid servants, and you were kind of contractually obligated, and people could take advantage of you, certainly, and they did. But the fact that, again, mainly just the talking point of, man, the Bible expects slavery. It's like, let's not stop there, right? Because that's a very shallow talking point, pretty much. Like, that's when, I mean, again, and Christians do it vice versa, when they say Islam is inherently all jihadists, or some people will go to that extreme, and they'll say, Sharia law just demands the beheadings and the executions of everybody, and I'm like, there's got to be more, right? And I haven't personally dug into the Quran as much, but just you can see when arguments lack depth, or when they lack a certain, I don't know, hindsight in light of history. Very, very short-sighted in that respect. Again, not to dismiss or condone the atrocities that American slavery or other institutions of slavery have committed, right? But to look at the cultural artifact of the Bible and say, this now is what is responsible for all these human behaviors, right? It was used as a beat stick, but we have to remember who's holding the book.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's people. And it certainly affords people the opportunity to use it as a weapon. But it comes back to that human decision.
Do you believe the Bible to be the Word of God, literally? Or do you acknowledge that there's human involvement?
That's something that I struggle with a lot, honestly, because the way I want to believe it is that it is, not only divinely inspired, but prophetically true. In that, I can trust every single word of it. And it's just the burden of interpretation and the burden of my own humanity and the humanity of people writing it. You understand that however inspired it was, it's like some dude took a feather or a pen or charcoal and just did their way with it, And so, yeah, I wish I could give you a better answer than that. And I think, like, Christian Cody, like 2 or 3 years ago, would have been like, yes, because that's the answer like you want to give, just like pure faith, no doubt whatsoever. I doubt a lot of the accuracy and validity of like the anthology itself. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Because just the way that it's been handed down and passed down through so many human hands, we certainly don't have the original information.
Yeah.
And we certainly don't have it in the context in which it was originally meant to be understood, right? And we still believe, again, that there's so much wisdom to be brought to us in our context, like in our day, and that God's words is still relevant, right? But it's like knowing that I was fundamentally not in Old Testament Israel, receiving the Old Testament books, the prophetic books. It's like, was this meant for me? The fact that I was not in first century Rome when Paul was penning a letter to Ephesus, the fact that I wasn't an Ephesian, right? Or Thessalonian. It's like, was this written for me? Sure, there could be God. Sure, there could be this plan of salvation, but it's like the fact that the anthology of the Bible itself was so handmade, however divinely inspired it was, plants those seeds of doubt in me. Not to necessarily its authenticity, but again, its ability to be weaponized, right, and manipulated to the extent that it certainly has been and probably will be, because I don't have enough faith in humans to do a whole lot better, you
Yeah.
know? So,
You could say the same thing about Islam too. For a lot of for hundreds of years, it was orally transmitted before it was written down into the Quran.
yeah.
So a lot of it gets lost for sure. But you go back to that thing where, like, did Moses really see a burning bush?
Right.
And did God tell him to write down these things on tablets and put it in the Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah.
Did like these things, do you believe them in them interpretively, or like what is your view on
Yeah, and so there's certainly just sections of the Bible that people argue are meant to be taken historically as opposed to poetically, because the Psalms are all poems, right?
Yeah.
It's like you can see that they're poems. But in terms of the historical accounts, the Levitical law, whether or not it was divinely inspired in the sense that like this is actually God's will, there's no doubt that Moses actually sat down and wrote like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, like in my mind, or like maybe even Numbers, depending on the timeline, right? Because it's just like there's no reason that this would just be concocted for any other reason than to do exactly what it says, is like establish laws for regulating the people, right, or controlling them, as some people say. The I guess the earliest accounts of like Genesis and even Exodus is more historical because it's just Moses' journey, but Genesis in particular, and then Revelation at the back end, the two bookends of the Bible literally are the ones that like people argue the most about. And even within the church, people argue about whether or not they should be taken literally or interpretively, because Genesis 1 and 2 are about Adam and Eve, and there's a billion bits about why the snake in the garden, there's a talking snake, and that should just dismiss the Bible in of itself, because talking snake crazy. Or Noah's Ark. People are like,
Right.
how the hell? Like Noah's Ark, what the hell is
can't
that?
fit two of you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, and people will, again, this is where I doubt our ability to retroactively understand anything, because people who want to be creation scientists about it all and say, this is exactly how they fit them all in the ark. You go to Ken Ham's exhibit, and I'm sure it's beautiful and amazing, but it's just like the absolute confidence and certainty with which they assert this is how it was done. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
But in that same sense, and this is probably where like people look at me and they're like, you're so naive or probably stupid. It's like, I also don't doubt the possibility that there was just something different about either that time or that space where things were happening where, sure, why not?
There are historical theories. You can say the river basins would flood very frequently and
Right.
things like that.
Right. And
Yeah.
so, and going beyond that in terms of just like the fact that I wasn't there, right, and my limited ability to look at the present and assume that everything that operates as it does in the present operated as if it did in the past, right? I don't trust my own limited perspective to make a rationalization based on that,
Okay.
right? And so I think that probably is more doubt than faith, if that makes sense. But it's kind of throwing my hands up in the air and saying, why not? And ultimately, it's the same. It's exactly the same way that people look at the Big Bang, in that it's not just theoretical. There's a lot of work that's been put into it. It looks very probable. That's
Evidence-based.
right.
Yeah.
Very, very evidence-based, and scientists have looked into it. But it's like the burden of not being there and doing all of this science retroactively, and trying to look backwards upon things instead of doing experiments in the present, which is scary when you think about what if we could recreate the Big Bang? That's terrifying in itself. But the fact that we're always looking backwards, history has this troublesome way of having cracks in it, because it just the lack of recorded whatever, and our inability to know the past and our inherent need to assume, that again, what is present now is how it was then or remotely similar, when I've seen the world change exponentially in 21 years.
Yeah.
Imagine a billion,